Yo, what's good everybody? Welcome to the channel. Today you and I are going to be taking a look at how to remake some trip hop drums that are kind of in the style of this. Now, if you're interested in the pad, the last video that I put up actually goes through how to do that from scratch. But today we are actually going to be taking a look at how to take any kind of break. Today we're actually going to be using an acoustic kit from Bitwig, just because I'm not at home, so I don't have my Superior Drummer library that's on my hard drive. And I didn't want to use a process break because you can, it's kind of like the fast way to do it. So if that's all you have, then you can kind of skip ahead to the further processing that we got. But as of now, what we're going to be working on is how to get these drums primed in order to resample, and then I'll show you a couple of tricks in order to get that gritty feel. So I've went ahead and let go or turned off all the effects that are supposed to be attached to this, and what we're left with is just a really dry kit. Now with this, one thing that you'll see is that I've kind of just made a cool little drum break, and it doesn't need to be anything complicated, but if you want a lot of variation or you want it to be somewhat humanistic, then one thing that you can do is make sure that you're playing around with your velocities on your overheads. So changing these hats into different velocities as a whole. I know that I just said that, sorry, but one thing that you can do, especially if you're in Bitwig, is to grab the panning here, or sorry, to grab the gain and to turn the mean down by say 2.2 or 2 decibels, and then turn the chaos up, and you'll see that these will actually now be a little bit more spread out. And this is super useful because if you are doing this, or you're changing the velocity or something of the sort, or even the gain, it doesn't really matter, then what this is going to do is add a little bit of humanistic feel to whatever it is that you're doing. And for the most part with trip hop drums, sometimes it has a little bit of swing, but it's really not like halftime drums or something. Most of the time there's just maybe 1 or 2 hits that give you that. For now, if you're brand new to this, just use a straight beat. It's fine. We can talk about rhythm another day. But now that we have done something like that, this is kind of what it sounds like. Now, one other thing that you'll notice with this is that the drum break is actually twice as fast as the tempo, and that's actually on purpose because whenever we get into resampling, whenever we make it into half of what it is, it's going to sound pitched down, and that's a big component of how to get those kind of gritty sounding drums in the first place. So with this, there's a lot of different ways that you can process these drums, but one of my biggest pieces of advice is to try to start from super dry sounds. You don't want a ton of reverb because all the compression and distortion that you're making in it is going to carry over into the printed sample, and you can always add that real type room reverb later, or if you know what you're doing, then maybe just add just a little bit. What we are going to touch though is we are going to make this a lot fatter by using the glue. And the glue is one of my favorite compressors just because it has the Pete clip built into it. It's basically Ableton's compressor. You can just use dynamics and a limiter. You really don't need to use this. It's more about why I'm using compression as opposed to what kind of compressor I'm using, if that makes sense. But basically we're trying to get everything to be a match level. And because this is already hitting at minus 0.2, we actually don't need to smash this as threshold all the way down and make it up. Instead, what I'm going to go for is what's called parallel compression, to where we're going to have a 50% mix and then see how things sound. So the way that parallel compression works, first and foremost, is we want to actually just smash it till it's about minus 8 to 12 dB. And the reason why is because this is just a good place to start. It's a good it's a good reference. And so if you want to do more or less, then you're more than welcome to. But through my experience, that minus 8 to minus 12 is generally the sweet spot for this kind of thing. But now that we have that, let's turn P-clip on, and we're going to push the makeup up until, obviously it's going to hit the red, but until it's just a little bit too far. So let's go ahead and see how far we can take this. So with that, one thing that I can actually hear for some reason is that it sounds like the rides on here are a little bit off, wherever that is. So let's make sure that everything is where it needs to be. So what I did was I unquantized the hats here. So I'm just going to replace these very quickly because I can hear that it was starting to get off. Rookie mistake. But let's go ahead and just grab these, and as long as we have just a little bit of variation, then that's fine. But now everything should be where it needs to be. I could have just quantized it, but that's fine. Shouldn't take too long. There we go. So now with this, it actually doesn't sound too bad, but let's go ahead and reduce this to where it has a nice mix between the two. Nice. So the next thing that we want to do with this is get a little bit of bit crushing on here. And we don't need to go crazy with this, but what I like to do is generally kind of just pull this down to, I don't know, something maybe like this or so. And it's not going to be super noticeable, but it's just going to cut the tops off just enough to where it's going to sound a little bit more lo-fi. Now what we can do is reduce the bits. Maybe like 12, sometimes 16. Oh, that is 16. Okay, so maybe like 12 to 14 is usually a good place to start. And then we can kind of just reduce that just a bit. So the last thing that I want to introduce with this is some kind of clipping. I tried G-clip, but G-clip is doing a weird thing with the interface, so we're just going to use eventide saturate. If you wanted to, like, let's say you have the glue or you have a glue compressor in Ableton, then you can just use the soft clip or the saturator with soft clip. It's fine. But really what we're going for here is just some kind of clipping that is going to kind of make these drums have not too much. We are kind of removing some of the dynamics in it, but if you look at this on an oscilloscope, then you'll see that these drums are smashed, but they're not going to sound like too crunchy. So you see here that we still got some transients and dynamics, but now what we can do is kind of just push this up just a little bit until they're a little bit more squarified. And you can see now that the Dorito looking things are a little bit more squarified on the transients, and that's pretty much all we need to do. Now, if we were going for like a crazier genre, then we could just smash the heck out of them, but we're going for a different feel for this, so we're not going to quite do that. So with this, like, this is pretty much all you need if you're using a relatively dry kit. And now what we can do is we can hit J and bounce these, and when we listen to this, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. At half speed, you're going to notice a huge difference. So the first thing that I want to do with this is we're going to set this to repitch mode, and then I'm going to tap open bracket, which is basically going to stretch this to double the time. And now let's take a listen to how this sounds. Now, the drum break itself is insignificant. I just wanted to make sure that I had a bunch of variation. So you could, you know, do something kind of like doom 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 ka. So we could grab this and we can go maybe even something like this, and then we can grab, you know, maybe this little fill that we've got right here and start to replace some of these. I'm not going to get too far into this, but just know that like the break itself doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same. So it's not really that big of a deal. But if we were to do something like this, boom, 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 ka. So we want to go like that. And then maybe we can drag this somewhere else to find a different hit, perhaps. And what I'm looking at is just the waveforms. Whenever they get big, you can tell that it's a bigger transient. So we just want to find something like that, because I'm sure that this is like a ride or something. So now that we have something like that, we can kind of do the same thing where we can rearrange the break in such a way. So anyways, I don't want to get too far into that to make it sound the way that I wanted to, but you can hear already just by doing just those basic processes that we're already kind of getting in that ballpark. Now, if you want to make these kind of more like that old school, then one thing that you can do is to take out some of the low end. So now, hold on, that ride is kind of bothering me, so let's go ahead and switch that up into something else to where we can just use something like that. So let's go ahead and maybe do something like this. There we go. I would change the ride out, but it's okay. So now that we have something like this, there's a couple of things that we can do depending on what it is that you're going for. The first thing I want to talk about is reverb. So if I were to introduce like a room now with this, then I'm going to show you with the stock reverb just because it doesn't really matter. But what we want to get into is this situation where this is at 100% mix and this one is dry. And the reason why is because it just gives you more control. Even though you can put stuff in the wet effects or in the tank effects or whatever, I typically don't use this reverb, so I wanted to show you by grouping. And again, if you're in Ableton or something, then you can just create a group. You can do it to where you just reduce the mix, but if we listen to this at 100%, then it makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of like hear the difference of what's happening. So really what the goal with this is to just make this relatively small at first and make it almost inaudible, and then slowly start to build up, and then we'll reduce the mix again to figure out how to like blend the two signals together. But what I'm doing is I'm basically making this as dry as possible right now. So let's see what this is. So what I want to do with this is I want to take out the low end because we really don't want that interfering with the kick. And from here, some other things that you might want to consider is like if you want to make this into a shimmer or something, then one thing you can do is grab a pitch shifter and pull this up by +12. It's weird, whenever you use the pitch shifter on Bitwig, you want to reduce the grain size, and then if you're using a kilohertz one, you want to increase the grain size. I don't know, it's just the way that it works. But take a listen. Maybe a mix between the two, rather. But you can kind of hear that now we have that really cool tone from that snare that we've pulled out of that. And you don't have to do this, but sometimes it's just nice to create a cool little shimmer like that. But now that we have this, we can kind of shape the room that we want to use. So let's go ahead and see what this sounds like with the original signal. It's going to be too much, but we're going to reduce it until it has a nice blend. That actually sounds pretty nice. So some other stuff that you can do for whatever reason, if you want to reintroduce low end or whatever, I'm going to show you this plugin just because it actually works really well for this particular kind of drum samples in general. Actually, the knock plugin works really well, and I haven't done a review on this, and I don't think that this is something that you need if you're trying to make really big drums. But the reason why this actually is relatively useful for resampling like old school drums and stuff is particularly for two reasons. One is actually from the sub that it can create from the kick, and two is because it has a really nice air like maker or air effect. And that was actually the reason why I bought this thing in the first place. But for whatever reason, if you want to introduce more sub to this, this will only focus on the low frequencies, so it'll actually give you a clean kick. Now I can see that it's picking up the snare, so maybe it doesn't work in every single scenario, but that's one thing that you can try. But the other thing that I do like is introducing some of this air, and sometimes that can bring back some of the crispiness of the drum break itself. I really don't think that this is necessary, but it can give you a little bit more grit if you're trying to make your drums bigger. But really what we can do beside all of that is the same trick that I've shown in a bunch of different videos, which the alternative would be to use a multipass and or an FX3 splitter and grab some kind of dynamics and just do a touch of upwards compression and turn the release all the way up and make it a short attack. And it doesn't make a huge difference, but it is just a nice little crispy maker. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit more dramatic so that way it sounds a little bit too much. And then finally, you can clip it again if you want to make the drums bigger than they need to be. But if we look at the processing that we have on this other drum break that I've made in the first place, you'll see that it's relatively simple. I just added some EQ in certain resonant places. Granted, it's a different drum break, but I did also add in some knock, which pretty much does the exact same thing that we were talking about from before. If you need more transient, you can just grab a transient control, or you can use the kilohertz transient shaper, or you can use drum bus, or I'm pretty sure that FL Studio has a transient shaper. So you just turn the attack up just a little bit and maybe reduce that. I guess I could show you, but it's kind of hard. And what I'm trying to do is not necessarily say like, here's how to make one specific style of drums. It's more of like, here's how we can utilize the tools to shape it how we want. And I wouldn't try to replicate a drum group or like a drum break that's exactly like something from Silent Hill or, you know, or trip hop. It's more about, hey, let's find something that we're happy with or something that we think sounds good. And that's why referencing is important, but it's important not to reference too closely, because I still feel like the vibe is there. The vibe of the trip hop is there, and we're in 2023. So sometimes we might want to evolve the way that we do things anyways, as opposed to trying to just replicate things from the past. But I digress. So if we wanted to, then we can just boost the transient ever so slightly. This actually says 14%, but you can see that the knob has been moved very little. But we can reduce the time here and see if we can make it just a little bit more short. And something that might be useful is moving the transient shaper over before the reverb as well, in case if we want that room to breathe out. So now let's go ahead and clip it. Hard clipping, soft clipping, doesn't matter. This really shouldn't sound too much different, to be honest. So I'm gonna remove this, but let's take a listen to what this sounds like without the processing. Because really, once we got to that having a clean break and repitching it, we were pretty much already there. But this is without the extra processing that we did. And this is with everything. So really, the magic behind all of this to get the timbre that you're looking for is really just make a clean break at twice the speed and then repitch it at half the speed. So that way, whenever everything kind of pitches down, it still has like a dirty feel, but the drums still sound pretty clean. And I've experimented with a lot of ways to do this in the past. Like if you look at the trip hop drum video that I did before, the one that's relatively popular, you'll see that I've had like an immense amount of processing on this. You don't need that. This is really what you need, is you need a clean break. You need to resample it, then pitch it down. You can add some subtle effects to it, but really to get that dirty feel, it's really not that complicated. I know that this video is long, but even still, it's more about exploring options as opposed to how to like get there from start to finish. So anyways, hopefully this gives you some insight on how to make some cool trip hop drums. But if you have any questions, then be sure to leave them in the comment section. I would also really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed to the video and the channel. And if you want to support me, then you can become a member. You can check out my patches at Alckemy.com, where I've got a lot of crazy neuro-based stuff, or a lot of different things. I've got demos on everything, so you know exactly what you're buying, or consider booking a lesson with me because I love to teach. So thank you all so much for watching. I will see you all in the next one.